really great suggestion, which I need to discuss with the TAs. But I'm going to ask you again, is there anything that comes to your mind right now beyond simply mechanisms for, improving your CP marks? I need to know more than that. And I'm talking literally about your learning right now. So if there's anything, please go ahead. Otherwise, we'll start with our class today.
I for one have disabled the waiting room so that people don't message again and again that they've been stuck in the waiting room because of some electricity issues or some connectivity issues, because that does happen, and then it does disturb the class since people join, people leave. So waiting room should not be there, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. We did get rid of the waiting room. That's correct. Um, but beyond that, so you say, Sharik, that you need to look at the presentation. So you guys don't want to do away with the presentation, because I would still upload it and you would still have access to the presentation. It's not like you wouldn't see the presentation. It's just that in real time it wouldn't be on a screen. So I think that's what I'm thinking about. So basically you could open the presentation for yourself and then you could like look at it while I was teaching, because I would use that as my guide also to like deliver the lecture, but I wouldn't refer to it as on the screen you can see, etc., etc. um Rania, what do you have? Go ahead.
Miss, I agree with Sharik because like when I later go and study from like the presentation, during the lecture we were discussing this while we were looking at this slide. So it helps with like uh, some visual memory. So that I really appreciate the presentation being there.
Okay, so what I so okay, thank you, that makes sense. I think so what I'll say is that maybe we can do it this way, that we can try on Wednesday. Today we'll use the presentation, because I think for online classes you do need it, for classes that are purely online. But I don't know how well that works in a hybrid model, because there's too much cognitive flexibility being required in a very short period of time for too many people. And so maybe on Wednesday we try without me using the presentation. And then you guys can tell me how well or not well that worked for you. Thank you. That helps. So you need the presentation as a visual aid, basically, is what you're saying. Um, okay, thank you. So today we begin now. If unless anybody has anything else to say, I've got 2 more minutes that I how do you say allocated for this. So if you have any other thoughts. No. Okay. Um, I guess. Haya, you want to say something? No. Okay. Um, Fine. Let's get on with it then. So last class we were talking about the prenatal stage of development. We spent quite a bit of time on that, and there were some really interesting questions that people were asking. And one of them that I want to touch on to help us also recap a little bit of what we had done in our last class. Question was that does developmental psychology, can it help the field of criminology, or can it help, or does it feed into the field of criminology, or can it be helpful in assessing later criminal behavior in life? And the answer to that question is absolutely yes. And there are a couple of facets for this, and they'll make sense when I go back to our previous class. So if you remember, in our previous class, we were talking about how certain factors of prenatal development, we see that there is already a formative brain, or the brain in the early stages is present by 3 to 8 weeks, right? Or was it months? I forget now. There you go. 3 to 8 weeks. And what this implies is that whatever is happening outside of the womb environment is having an impact on that baby, on that fetus, essentially, because it is a fetus. And that can be anything from the mother consuming toxic substances to some sort of disruptions in the outside world, in the outside environment. Children, no, fetuses can pick up on that. And we know that there can be some trauma that happens in that stage as well, which has an impact on later developmental trajectories, right? Um, and so let me give you an example, which is from the diaries of somebody who studies pathology in children, okay? And who studies, well, not just pathology, but studies mental illness or psychological disorders or their emergence in children. He deals with children, he's a child psychiatrist. And so one of the cases that he was consulting on was the case of a boy who was 17 or 18 years old, and he was in jail um, for raping and killing two girls who were 13 and 12 years old. And he did this when he himself was 14 years old. Then the girls lived in his building. They were hanging out. Something happened. He killed them, and he raped them and he killed them. He assaulted them and he killed them. And so this man was brought in to consult on this case. And so what he writes is that he discovers about this boy's life. When he meets the boy does not show any what we call in psychology affect, which is an emotional expression or any sort of facial cues. You know, we call that your affect when it's related to some sort of emotional response, or some sort of, you know, you have a sense of connection. But he presented very flat affect. He was very sort of detached and very cold when he was discussing his crime. And it was sort of like, you know, he didn't exactly even recognize the damage that he had done. It was something that he was unable to really comprehend. He knew that he had done something very violent, but there was no regret. There was no emotional affect, right? Like I said, or guilt or remorse or anything. And that's usually something that we also, this lack of affect, lack of emotional expression is something we associate with psychopathy. Okay, psychopaths are known for this lack of their ability to feel emotion the way that you and I would. And so when this psychiatrist, his name is Perry, yeah, Dr. Perry. So Dr. Perry, when he found out more about this child's life, what he learned was that when this kid was really little, and I want you to remember this story, particularly when we move on towards the end of today's lecture. Okay, now what he discovers is that this little boy, he's born to very poor parents. The mother is basically taking care of him, and she already has another son who is older, and she has just moved to New York. She has this infant baby, and she's got this older son, and she's moved from a family home where there's, you know, a lot of people, and from a culture where people kind of raise children together, much like ours, where, you know, everybody in your family has a role in raising you, particularly for those of us who grew up in joint family systems. You know what that looks like, right? And so this mother, she has this child, and she moves into a small apartment where she is disconnected from that family network that she would have had access to. And again, she's in the United States, very poor family. There is no way for her to access things like babysitting or daycare or preschool, right? And so this infant, right now, he's still an infant, she doesn't know what to do. She herself is suffering from postpartum depression. So she tends to, whenever he cries, her response is that she leaves him alone at home, and she takes her older son, who's about 2, 3 years old at this time, and they go on these long walks, and they leave this baby alone for hours, right? And this baby, and up until 2 years old, this continues to happen on and off because she doesn't know how to deal with this infant on her own, right? She's brought up her 3-year-old using all this family support, but for the infant, she doesn't know how to do it, so she leaves him alone. And so eventually, After he turns 2, she reports that he has stopped crying. And as he grows older, he, starts to get into trouble at school. It starts small acts of insubordination, a little bit of bullying here and there, beating up, getting into fights. And it sort of escalates, right? And it escalates to the point where, this child is referred to child services, he's sent to the school psychologist, a bunch of people continue to assess him. And he's also sent to the church pastor. The church pastor talks to him, but nobody can get through because he just kind of doesn't respond, right? He doesn't connect with anyone. He doesn't make the effort or doesn't seem to have the ability to make these human connections. Um, and fast forward a couple of years after that, he commits this crime. And at the age of 17, which is when Dr. Perry meets him, he is, his pathology has become solidified. It's there, it's absolutely present. Um, and so I'm telling you the story because I'm asking you to understand how the prenatal environment of this child was also volatile, right? Because you can assume that the mother is under some sort of stress as she's making this move into a smaller apartment, breaking away from her family. She's an immigrant, doesn't speak the language. She herself is going through her own sort of mental traumas and processes. That's impacting her child. And then when the child is actually in the world, there is another clear neglect that happens, right? We know that babies need skin to skin contact to feel secure and to feel attached. And we'll talk about that later. But um, this is a very extreme example, of course, but a very clear example of how, yes, absolutely, developmental psychology, with its focus on the impact that prenatal environments as well as early childhood environments have on your personality development, on the way that you see the world. All of that is so important, that it does have a direct sort of positive contribution that it can make to the field of criminology. And now I hope you're more clear on the way that the environment can influence a child. And this term that I just told you, it's called skin hunger. So keep that in your head. Okay, skin hunger. That's what we call it. All right. So then, unless you have any questions, I would like to move forward. Right. Okay. Arsal had also this question. Arish, yeah, he didn't know the difference between right and wrong in the sense that he didn't have any sort of emotional consciousness, right? So of his own. So he was able to maybe understand other people's emotions, but there was no mirror response within him. Okay. And Arsal's question, if a mother faces physical abuse and trauma during pregnancy, does it imply the child's behavior will be violent? And would such events have a temporary effect on the personality of a child? And is it possible the child grows up to have a completely different personality? So, number one, if the mother faces physical abuse and trauma during pregnancy, yes, there will be an impact on the development of the fetus. Yes, the fetus will experience that trauma and that impact because specifically you said physical abuse, right? That's a direct impact on the living environment of the fetus itself. So consider that. Second, remember what we talked about where do you remember when we were doing epigenetics and you saw the formation of the epigenetic marker in that diagram where the mother was consuming toxic substances, which then created this child's sort of inability to have the right amount of he didn't have nutrition when he was in the womb, and then when he grew up, he had many developmental sort of issues with aggression and so on and so forth. And then that eventually you see that epigenetic marker was formed on gene expression. So to your question, yes, physical abuse will have an impact, but what the rest of your question asks is that impact temporary, and can it completely shape personality to be different? That's what you're asking. And the truth is that depends very much on the environment the child receives after he or she or they are born. Okay, so we cannot again give a definitive sort of a definitive yes or no answer, because it's very much about what the qualities of that environment look like, right? And again, this draws us back to how important that 0 to 3 age in early childhood is. And there are a lot of disorders that can be triggered or can be started at that age if the child doesn't get the right care and the right support. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And some of them are, how can you say, like I would say, mitigated. Some of them can be mitigated by getting the right identification and the right treatment and the right supports at the right time. But again, the earlier, the better, right? That's the rule of thumb with any sort of psychological illness that we talk about. The earlier you are able to get help, the better your chances are. Same thing applies to schizophrenia, for example. The earlier in life that it occurs, the better the prognosis is for the treatment, in the sense that the longer then the periods of recovery are when you talk about something like schizophrenia, where there isn't a cure, a final cure that, oh, you take this and now your treatment has ended, right? All right, now, isn't it very hard to test if prenatal stressors cause neurobiological changes? Yes, and a lot of this is correlation work, right? Because you can see, okay, there's maybe a change in the structure of the brain, but like, it's only today that we have started to be able to see this in a lot more detail as technology has kind of evolved and allowed us access. But you're right, it is hard to test exactly, right? Which is the same problem that we have with behavior genetics because of small gene effects. Remember, I told you it's impossible to account for all the small gene effects, and also it's impossible really to give these sort of down to the right percentile answers because of the fact that lived experience, meaning the environment that each of us is exposed to, and our experience of that environment is so diverse and so different. It's hard to quantify these into the absolute answers that you're looking for. Um, Malaika, I want you to hold that question when we study attachment theory later. Jyoti, you're saying nature and nurture affect prenatal development. Yes, that's correct. Specifically altering the brain in a way that, yes, well, I mean, think about it. Some mothers, when they consume toxic substances, the baby that is born has an underdeveloped brain or body, right? That's a very direct effect. And the child psychopathology, yes, it does imply that if maybe when he was 6 or 7 and he first was referred to a school psychologist, if different approaches perhaps had been used, perhaps if somebody had inquired about that early childhood experience that he had of just being left alone as a baby for 11, 12 hours at a time to cry his heart out, maybe if that had come to light earlier rather than after the crime had been committed, he may have gotten help that would have helped him understand how to harness those negative emotions and negative thoughts, and feel connected. Thing that's missing for this particular case study was the feeling of human connection. I kept saying that, right? And that means when you don't see meaning in relationships, and especially in your primary caregiving relationships, that is then the model with which you view the world. Okay? You don't see the world as a place of connection, as a place of belonging, as a place of from a place of trust. You see it from a place of mistrust. You don't know when you don't know what emotional connection feels like, then how are you supposed to be able to emotionally connect, right? So about this child, and who do you learn emotional connection from? You learn it in the very first instance when you are born from your primary caregivers. And we'll talk about this, so I'm going to go on now. Sana, I'm sorry, I'll have to not respond to your question right now. It's also straightforward, and I think I've answered it a few times. So just go back to one of our lectures for the epigenetic link. Now, like I've been saying, 0 to 3, why have I been harping on about 0 to 3 as one of the most, impactful experiences in shaping who you become? It's because at that point, look at these images on the slide right now, brain development. You have these are your neural pathways. So when you're a newborn, you see that they're kind of like not super connected to each other. They're not as web-like, you know. But by 3 months, it's like they kind of triple. Your neural networks have tripled. They've become more connected. You see that there are more axons, right? And there are more synaptic gaps, and there seems to be a lot more there. And then as you go on to the last what do you call this panel, by 15 months, which is 1.3 years old, there it's like from newborn to 15 months, the neural networks and their connectivity has almost like quadrupled, right? And 0 to 3 is the most rapid period of brain development, meaning that this is the point at which all those structures, these ones right here, um, you see that all of that has now started to take more form and more shape. And all of that is obviously happening. Number one, some of it is your natural biological processes, but there's more than that also, right? The environment is shaping literally your physical brain, and you can see it here because you can see these connections, right? And this is actually what it looks like. And the areas that really develop, and this is like common sense as well. When do most children say their first word? Between the age of maybe 1 to about 1.5, they're saying at least one word, right? The capacity for language has begun to develop. You see this network forming. The capacity for memory has also begun to become stronger. So, for instance, from being a newborn to being 1.5 years old, the baby can recognize not just the smell and the scent, not just the scent of the mother, but also the face of the mother, right? So there's like more memory that is now available. There's also a lot that happens in terms of movement, because think about it, newborns cannot even turn themselves over. It's by 3 months old that babies are able to roll over. So that physical motor sense is like developing at that point, right? And then from rolling over, by 6 to 8 months, infants are crawling. And then from crawling, it goes on to walking. And from walking, it goes on to running. So just that small thing is indicative of this rapid development in the actual physical structure of the brain. Um, and so that happens, and then only once those basic capacities have been developed is when children are now able to start to think a little bit um, in terms of rationality. And I'm not saying they can think rationally. What I'm saying is that their ability to think rationally starts to develop at this stage, after the basic things you need to be able to think rationally are in place, such as memory and speech, the most basic level, right? Um, yeah, somebody has a question. There's a girl I can't see, so I can't see your names on this. So I see a girl in glasses who has a hand raised. I don't know your name, but I'm lowering your hand, but you're not saying anything.
Mrs. Jyoti, hi.
Yes, Joe, go ahead.
Miss, my question is that, for example, the case study that you mentioned, the baby had a lot of trauma, right? And he was left alone for 2 years. So, will it alter the kind of brain development he will have? Like, will he be able to talk, walk, or crawl later in life, like a lot more later in life than normal babies do, who have had actual proper care and warmth at their homes?
Well, one thing that stood out for this case was that this child didn't talk for a long time. He started talking much later than your average child would talk. So yeah, you're right. That would happen. Mohammed Ali.
Um, my question, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can
So
hear
my
you. Go ahead.
question is, कि, My question is that you said there's a rapid period of brain development between the ages of 0 to 3, and newborns, they at first they can't even walk. So isn't like human brain development really slow compared to other animals? Because like other animals, when they're born, like 2 days later, on the same day, they are able to walk themselves, and they know they have a bit of instincts that already developed. Like after birth, giraffes babies and cows babies, they are able to walk themselves. They have intuition. So human beings require a period of 3 years to develop, and they need intensive care in those years. And if that care is not provided, so they are vulnerable to uh, different disorders. So isn't human brain development really slow?
No, human brain development, when you consider the fact of what or how much more the human brain can do as opposed to the different animals you mentioned, that's the point at which you realize that for all that our brain can do, it actually develops very, very fast, right? So you kind of put it in context. And so, yes, you would say, okay, for instance, kittens, when they're born, they're blind, right? And their eyes are closed. And then eventually their eyes open. And then by the time a kitten becomes a cat at the age of 1, uh, she has or he has learned how to eat and how to clean, how to self-clean, how to care, how to protect territory, etc., etc., etc. Right? All those behaviors have been learned, and now the kitten is a cat, and this is the cat that's going to grow old. Okay, but with a human baby, it's different because it's not as simple, right? So once you've learned, for example, to chew your food, you go on and you develop taste preferences, you develop a palate, you learn how to cook the foods that you like. That's a lot more complex, and your tastes and your preferences and your palate can change and evolve. Let's say you move to a different country, you acquire an entirely new taste palette. And it's a very small example I'm giving you, but just to illustrate that there's a great deal of difference in what the human brain is capable of as opposed to the animal brain. And so when you consider what all the human brain can do, then no, I wouldn't say it's slow. That's what I would say. So I would contextualize your comparison. And now coming back to this. So if a child is not stimulated, there will be a hindrance in brain growth. Yeah, but I need you to think a little more critically. That's a foregone conclusion, right? I mean, yes, obviously, the environment doesn't stimulate growth. We already know the environment is responsible for how your brain develops. So obviously, there will be that. Our cognition becomes more complex as we grow older. And the reason for that is right here on the slide. 3 to 6 years, your frontal lobe, the part of your brain that is most responsible, that deals with your rationality, your judgment, your decision making, that's the point at which that starts to become better, that starts to become more let's say the neural networks become denser in that part of the brain, you start to actually use these capacities by the time you're 6 or 7 years old. And as you get older, those capacities again become stronger and you can deal with more sort of challenging problems. And then finally, by the time you hit adolescence, which is basically also usually defined as the onset of puberty, although that is problematic for different reasons, which I'm not going to get into right now. But during adolescence, which you can say again, puberty, your hormones are released, and along with that hormone release, you start to learn, or rather more effectively self-regulate. You develop cognitive flexibility, which means that you can multitask as you become an adolescent, and your language continues to develop. And actually, so after 0 to 3 years, the next most rapid period of brain development happens when you are an adolescent. So right now, if you are 18, you are still in that most rapid period, second most rapid period of brain development. So a lot of things that will define the kind of person you become are happening to you right now in adolescence, because at this point, your frontal lobe is much more developed now than it was 5 to 7 years ago. At the same time, the amount of words, just something very small, the amount of words you know has expanded dramatically and drastically over the past 5 years. If you just consider those two things, or consider the other thing, maybe 5 to 7 years ago, if you wanted a particular thing for dinner and your parents didn't give it to you, you threw a tantrum, you cried, you kicked, you screamed. Today you'll be like, fine, I'm not eating. Okay, or you'll be like, fine, I'll just eat whatever's there, or fine, I'll make myself a sandwich. You are responding in different ways than you did before. Self-regulation has happened, right? In some way or form, you're learning how to constrain your emotional reactions, or inhibit rather your emotional reactions, part of self-regulation. And so think about these things, all right? Developmentally, this is a broad trajectory. So your main takeaways are: number one, the prenatal environment affects you, your development, your brain development, your physiological development, physical development. Number two, 0 to 3 is the most sensitive time for brain development, it's the most rapid time for brain development in the entire human experience, in the entire human lifespan. Point number three, it's from 3 to 6 that your rational, sort of the foundations of rationality begin to emerge. Point number four, the next most rapid period of brain development after infancy, 0 to 3, is your adolescence, which is basically usually generally defined as the onset of puberty. For convenience sake, you can think about it as being 11 to 18 years of age is the second most rapid period of brain development. This is when language literally proliferates, in the sense that your vocabulary, your expression, all of that becomes extremely complex. Your capacity for abstract thought, so that basic capacity for rationality now becomes the ability to think in abstractions, to consider philosophy, for example, to grapple with ideas, to think critically, and so on and so forth. Your ability, for instance, to take other people's perspective is something that becomes a lot better by the time you get to this age. But again, that is dependent on the environment that you're exposed to. All right. So these are your 4-5 main key, takeaways from what we've done so far. And now the next thing we're going to talk about today is one of the most influential theories of how our cognition develops. All right. So the first thing, because you are in an intro to psychology course, we've been using this word cognition over and over. I want to just make sure you remember that definition. I'm going to change the slide quickly. So what is that definition? What is cognition? When we are talking about cognition or using the word cognition, what does that mean? Laiba, go ahead.
Hello, Miss, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I would say the cognition is the thinking process, like how you think, the critical thinking and stuff. And yeah, so that is cognition, and it is developed when you are since your childhood. So like your brain, आपका जो brain होता है वो उस चीज को develop कर रहा होता है इसके और ये डिफरेंट स्टेजेस से होती है एंड उसमें फिर 7 to 8 years में आप किसी चीज को मतलब सॉरी कॉन्क्रीट भी होती है देन आफ्टर दैट इसको थोड़ा सा एब्स्ट्रैक्ट कॉन्सेप्ट की तरफ जाती है.
That's partially correct. Yes, some of it is absolutely to do with your capacity for planning and judgment. That's part of your cognition. But Abdullah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I would say cognition is a like umbrella term to sort of define the knowledge and like experiences that we gain through our mental processes and actions.
Okay, what are these specific mental processes that help us gain knowledge? Okay, or like Laiba said, they become more complex, right? But what are they? What are the mental processes?
I would say senses is something that we get knowledge through, and then our brain process that information. Like for example, in terms of eye, we get the image, and then our brain process it, and then we can use it to recall or sort of draw an image in our head, something like that.
Correct. That's one cognitive ability, perception. Sensation perception is one cognitive ability. But you're right, you started by saying cognition is an umbrella term. if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes,
So
yes,
now
yes, yes.
if I just go to the chat now, I want to come to somebody. You're all saying the same thing on chat, you guys. If one person has said it, then 10 people don't need to say it. I'm just gonna go with what Naima is saying here: thinking, knowing, remembering, judging, problem solving, and communicating. Remember that language is part and parcel of cognition, which means that communication is part and parcel of cognition. So if you must remember a basic definition of what is cognition, you are absolutely, you guys have all been correct in saying that it refers to your mental processes, your thought processes, but what those thought processes are: um, language, memory, right? Language and speech, so that's communication. Learning, memory, I forgot the rest. Wait, sorry. So let me recall. There's like a particular way I say this. So it involves learning, remembering, communicating, and understanding. Okay, that's essentially in a nutshell. And problem solving. And problem solving. That is your mental processes involved in cognition. Okay. Now, within each of these, there's a large number of interconnections. So, for example, when I talk about memory, I have to also consider learning, because how do you learn and then remember what you've learned, right? So, memory processes are very much involved. Or if I'm talking about communicating, how do you remember the words that you know? You use your memory, right? Um, so if you've ever had a moment where you've been talking and you're like, I can't remember the word, do you remember the word? I can't remember that particular word. You're straining your memory. So your memory is very much involved when you're communicating as well, right? So that is why we can use the word cognition to refer to all of these mental processes, right? That's why cognition is a really good umbrella word to use, because all of these processes are so interlinked. So when you talk about learning, you have to also talk about language. If I were to sit here and if I were to teach you this class in French, would you understand it? No, you wouldn't, because this is not a language you possibly know, right? So obviously language plays a large part in learning as well. Um, at the same time, when you learn a new language, it strengthens your memory. So you have to consider everything kind of moves, side by side. So when we talk about cognition, thinking, learning, remembering, knowing, making meaning of the world, communicating, we have to consider the most fundamental theory, which is Jean Piaget's. And Piaget was a clinical developmental psychologist. He was a cognitive developmentalist, and he was Swiss, and his ideas continue to be used all over the world in child development studies, in classrooms, and so on and so forth. And so with Piaget, we have to. Sorry, I got distracted by your chat questions. I will request, please don't say random things on chat. Okay, it's distracting for me. So sorry. So Jean Piaget, clinical cognitive developmentalist, he wants to figure out how children think, right? And the reason he comes up with this, and he's like, oh, I want to know how children think, is because he himself had these little children, and he would see how his children, played with their toys. He would see the kinds of questions his children asked, and he realized, and this was a very revolutionary finding for the time that Piaget was working in, which was the 1950s, 30s to 50s is when he was sort of, doing all his work. And at that point, the notion of childhood was that children are basically miniature adults, right? Which implies that children are born with all the adult capacities already in them, and these capacities just become stronger as they grow older. And so when you talk to a child, you can talk to a child the same way you talk to an adult. The child can understand you. But Piaget said, no, I don't think that children are miniature adults. I think, in fact, that children are born, yes, absolutely, with certain capacities and capabilities, but those capacities and capabilities are completely unformed at birth. They just have the potential to develop them. Okay? So he says, how do children understand the world? Clearly, they understand the world in a very different way than adults do. So the first thing he came up with was that when children are born, um, they start to create these mental categories in their brains, right? And these mental categories sort of like molds, right? Like shapes. If you've ever baked a cake, you know what a mold is, right? So he's like, we have these categories in our minds, and we make sense of the world by putting the information we're receiving into particular categories, right? That's what children do, according to Piaget. In childhood, and actually, sorry, that's what we all do, but according to Piaget, in childhood is when these schemas, these categories, at their most foundational level begin to form. And so, as the child moves through life and acquires different information and different experiences, these schemas become more finely developed. And the two processes he talks about as far as schemas are concerned are accommodation and assimilation. So accommodation is where you already have a particular category, but based on the information you receive, you revise that category so that the new information can also fit in and still continue to make sense. Because remember, end of the day, the schemas are categories that help you make sense of all the information you're receiving, right? So you're putting it into these boxes so that it all fits and you can understand the world around you. So the second thing is where when you are assimilating, the schema itself doesn't need to change. Okay. When you're accommodating, the information cannot fit in the schema as it currently is. So maybe you need to subdivide that category, right? Have you ever tried to do research and found outlier information and you're like, okay, it doesn't directly relate to my topic, but it does somehow. So I'm going to put this as a side category or a subcategory. So think of assimilation as making sort of these subcategories within schemas so that schemas can fit whatever this new information. Sorry, assimilation is where you don't need to modify the schema, whereas when you're accommodating, you have to change the schema so the world still makes sense. Very small example of this. Imagine this. You are an infant. You obviously have never even seen a table before, right? You see a table and you don't even know that it's a table. Okay. And your mother points to the table and she says, this is a table, right? She keeps saying, this is a table, this is a table, this is a table. And you see everywhere you go, she points to a table in that room and she says, here's a table, here's a table, here's a table. And so all the tables. And so in your mind, there's a category, it's called table. Okay, there's the schema, it's called table. And the baseline for that schema is that anything that is like a wooden platform and has 4 legs and people put things on it, it's a table. Okay? Now you get a little bit older, and for the first time in your life, right, maybe you're about a year old, you see a table that only has 1 leg. And you're like, what is this? Is this a chair? No, a chair also has 4 legs. Is this a stool? No, but there are things on it. Right? It gets confusing. And then you realize, oh, wait, tables can actually be 3-legged, tables can be 1-legged, tables can be square, tables can be round, people can sit on tables, people can eat at tables, people can put things on tables. Do you understand what's happening to this child's brain? He's receiving information for the first time and seeing there are different categories of something. And so that basic schema of tables has to be modified so that these 3-legged and 1-legged tables can also inform that category. As you grow older, the information you're exposed to becomes more and more diverse. So your schemas continue to change. Some may not change, but some will change, right? And so according to Piaget, cognition rests on these categories. We use these schemas to make sense of the world, and we use these schemas in a manner where new information is not rejected, it is simply put into the right category, or a particular schema category is modified so that the new information can continue to make sense to us in some way or some form. All right, that is at the most basic level what Piaget understood. And this was really important because remember I said that according to Piaget, all of us use schemas to make sense of the world. But the difference was that he said that when you are a child, your schemas are just starting to develop. It's not like you're born with all the schemas. You're not born as a miniature adult. That was his most revolutionary sort of finding. And so, building on that, he said that we start to develop as a series of stages. Remember what we talked about. Development can be seen as continuous or discontinuous. Where we see development as discontinuous, we're talking about stages. Can't go to level 4 without crossing 1, 2, and 3. Can't go to level 2 without passing level 1. There's no skipping. There's no, level up here. And basically what that implies is that according to Piaget, at every single stage of cognitive development, we acquire new abilities that we could not have acquired without whatever we got from the prior stage, which is why we have to go through the prior stage to get to the next one. Okay, if there are any questions, I'm going to pause for a bit because the stages are pretty straightforward once you understand this building block sort of model. Okay. Liman, did I say your name correctly or is it Iman? Okay.
Iman.
Iman. So an example of assimilation would be that you have this category, a schema for relatives, okay? And meaning people who are related to you, right? And so your mother keeps saying, this is your family, this is your family, this is your family, right? And then as you get older, you understand that in your family, you've got cousins, you've got aunts, you've got uncles. So there are different types of family members, but they're all family, right? And so you don't need to modify the schema of family to fit in all these aunts and uncles. The relationships themselves don't matter. So assimilation, you just put that information into the same category without needing to change the category, right? But where you're talking about something different, where let's say on the flip side, if you met a family friend and your mother said, this is also your family. So then the underlying definition of, oh, my family is only people who are related to me by blood, it shifts, it changes, right? Or if your parents adopt a child and you're introduced to your adopted brother or sister, your mental category for what brother or sister is, which might currently be by blood, it shifts and it changes. You have to accommodate, okay? But when you're assimilating, you don't have to change the category because the information still makes sense within this category. Okay, you can put that information into the category and it doesn't fall apart. If that's clear, Iman, then I can get on with this.
Yes, that's clear. Thank you.
Okay. So according to Piaget, these are the 4 stages of development, cognitive development that happen in your childhood. The first one is the sensory motor stage. Then the second one is a pre-operational. The third one is concrete operational. And then as we go on, you get to the 4th stage, which is formal operational. As you can tell, each of these stages starts right at birth, age 0 to 2, and then 3 to 6, and then 7 to 11, and then 12 to 18. Okay. So he's literally going from infancy, early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence. That is how he's looking at cognitive development. And what he's saying is that in the first stage, sensory motor, sensory implies the use of your senses, motor implies the use of movement. In the second stage, pre-operational, the word operational is used to refer to logic, okay? The operations he's talking about are logical operations. At what point does your cognition enable you to think logically? And how does that logic become better and better as you grow older? How does your logical reasoning improve as you grow older? Because your cognitive abilities of thinking, remembering, communicating, and so on and so forth have become stronger and more complex. All right. And so pre-operational, prior to the development of logical operation abilities. Then you have concrete operational. Concrete meaning in front of you, not abstract logical thinking, but stuff that you can see. 2 plus 2 is 4, concrete operational stage. And then you go to the formal operational stage where you can think about what is the meaning of life? Is capital punishment always justified? Right? Those are intangible thoughts. Or rather, not intangible, but those are abstract thoughts, right? And so according to him, it has to start at age 0 with the sensory motor stage, at which point you only have your senses and your movement to receive information and make sense of the world. And using senses and movement, according to Piaget, what happens is that you, as an infant, acquire slowly object permanence, which is, I've gone over this before, but basically knowing that just because you can't see something doesn't mean it has stopped existing. But Piaget said this is important. He said this emerges by the age of 2. But recent studies on object permanence have revealed that children, babies as young as 3.5, 4 months old, will show some sign of having object permanence. Okay, again, this is assumptions because you're looking at babies who can't talk, so you can't really know that they have object permanence. You're determining it from their reactions. But a small experiment that they did was baby math. It was conducted by a researcher named Wang. And when Wang did baby math, she was like really surprised because she saw that children actually looked for what they thought was the missing piece. So she would show children, let's say 2 figures or 3 figures, and then remove one of the figures, right? And by children right now, I mean babies. And so she would remove 1 or 2 of the figures, and she noticed that those infants as small as 3.5 months old or 4 months old would look to see where that 3rd figure is, which shows that they had some memory of that 3rd figure existing. Right? So there are critiques of Piaget assuming that object permanence emerges at or before or after age 2. The second thing he talked about is called egocentrism, where children, he said, are only capable of thinking about their own point of view. They are only seeing the world from their perspective. They don't understand, let's say, social cues, right? They can't pick up on another person's mental state or emotional state unless explicitly told to them. Which is why, if you think about it, if you've had a little child, a little sibling, you often have to tell them, you should share with your friend, share your toys with your friend. They'll feel good, they'll feel welcome, right? Or you have to tell them something like, don't I don't know, you have to like don't cry. And I'm sorry, I'm not a parent, so I don't have a lot of examples like this, but I suppose one other example could be don't shout at your little sister, she doesn't understand what you're doing. And you could say that to even a 5-year-old, right? Who might be complaining that their 2-year-old sibling keeps on taking their toy, and a lot of parents would be like, it's okay, you should share, they don't know it's your toy, right? Or for instance, sometimes children will do really ridiculous things, like you'll have a guest come to your house and they'll hit the guest, and you're like, don't do that, that's not good. Or you'll tell the child, okay, a guest has come, say hello, this is what we do. You're teaching the child that it's important now to take other people's perspectives. But the child, according to Piaget, is only capable of taking their own perspective, which is why we have to teach things like sharing, right? Or we have to teach that certain things you say or do can be hurtful or rude. Now, pre-operational, according to Piaget, by the time you're 3 years old, you start to develop the fundamental capacities now that will enable you to perform logical operations later on in a few years' time. And so he commented particularly on language development, on pretend play, um, on drawing, because what children were drawing to Piaget was a sign of what they were able to represent cognitively and hold in their memory, basically, and recreate. He also talked about false beliefs and theory of mind. Now, I'll go one by one with these. Language development refers to the fact that by the age of 3, you see, in infancy, and we'll do this when we talk about language development, which is an entire section, so hold your more complex questions for that, please. But at the age of 0, children don't have language, okay? They use sounds. Eventually, by the age of 2, those sounds become proper formative, sort of what we call phonemes. And after that, they become proper words. And so by the time a child is 3 to 6 years old, the development happens in a sense that the child, instead of saying, water give, can now say, I want water, right? So that grammatical ability, the ability to start to construct sentences, starts to grow, according to Piaget, once a child is 3, and really starts to kick off in that sense. And the child becomes capable of, as he goes towards 6 years of age, constructing sentences that are longer in length and are more grammatically correct. Okay. So again, like I said, give water, maybe by the age of 2, that's what the kid is saying. By the age of 4, the kid might be saying, I want water. By the age of 6, the child might say, I am thirsty, I want water. Right? So language development, becoming more complex. Second, pretend play. This is, I mean, we've all seen this, you know, little kids will often, they'll act like they're the teacher, you're the student, they're having a tea party, you're the princess, they're the queen, they're the doctor, you're the nurse, or they're the patient, you're the doctor, or they're the pilot, you're the passenger. All of these are games that we see children play, right? They're the race car driver. Have you seen all of this? Children do a lot of role playing. What they're doing when they're playing these roles is that they're basically looking at the environment around them, because like teacher is one of the most common ones that children do, as well as doctor, because these are two experiences that they have had repeatedly by this time, right? They start going to school, they know what the teacher is, they are representing that in their mind and then acting it out as they understand it. The biggest advantage of children engaging in pretend play is that they are developing and refining, number one, their memory, number two, their language skills. They'll say things that they possibly don't understand immediately, but like they're just revising, remembering those words, and recreating those situations, right? And so role play is a big part of pretend play, but pretend play actually enables the child to recreate the world that they are seeing in order for them to make sense of it. Which shows that there has been more growth in memory, more growth in language, more growth in, most importantly, the capacity for perspective taking. Through role play, through pretend play, children's theory of mind improves and starts to become better. Right? Theory of mind is, again, I'll repeat this, the ability to take the perspective of another person. It is not empathy. Please don't confuse it. Okay? Everybody has theory of mind to varying degrees, but empathy is something very different from theory of mind. Theory of mind simply means taking the perspective of other people. So if I hit you, you will be hurt. Theory of mind. Okay. If you come to my house and I ignore you, you will feel unwelcome. Theory of mind. Perspective taking. That capacity starts to develop, right? Now, remember, you're going now from egocentrism, where I can only see the world from my own point of view, to theory of mind, where you're able to see other people's perspectives or other people's points of view. Now, the last thing is false beliefs. At this age, children are still displaying false beliefs. The Band-Aid test, very, very, very huge, I would say, but also like very illuminative experiment was they would show children a box of Band-Aids and they would say, what's inside this box? And the children would look at the picture of the Band-Aids and they'd say, Band-Aids. The researchers would open the box and there would be pencils inside it. Okay? And they would put the pencils back inside the box and they would tell the children, okay, now tell your friend or whatever what's inside the box. And the children would again say Band-Aids. Okay. I think it's very cute because it's very like innocent and naive childhood, whatever. But from a researcher's point of view, what it's showing is that children do not, at this point, they're still not able to differentiate between true and false beliefs, right? So if it says A, it should be A. And even if I'm seeing evidence that it's not A, I still believe it's A. That's a false belief. Okay, so they still hold these false beliefs, which is why this is pre-operational. This is not logical thought, is it? I'm showing you a box, it has a picture of Band-Aids. I show you that there are actually just pencils inside it. But when I ask you to tell your friend what's inside the box, you're gonna say Band-Aids. Even though you have seen it's not, because your thought capacity is illogical, right? Which is why this is the pre-logical, pre-operational stage. When you get to the next stage, which is concrete operational, 7 to 11, according to Piaget, some really important things start to come up, okay? This is the age at which you learn how to count. Numeracy skills emerge. Conservation, you learn to differentiate between volume and surface area. You understand that two glasses, one tall and one short, can still have the exact same amount of water, which when you're younger, you don't understand. You think the tall glass has more water because the concept of volume and density and surface area, you don't have an inherent understanding of it. Second thing, reversibility, very important. You kind of remember directions now. Right, at the most basic level, reversibility, if you want to understand what it is, it means the ability to see that logical operations can be reverse performed as well. So if you're going from your home to your school, you can also go from your school to your home, because now also your memory has developed. So number one, you remember the directions, but you can find your way in reverse as well. If 2 plus 2 is 4, then you understand that 4 minus 2 is 2. You can reverse the logical operational. But again, very basic logical operations, right? From 7 to 11, what do you learn? Do you learn Pythagoras theorem at this age? No, because you're not able to hold that thought in your head and see what a triangle looks like in here. But you do, and you do learn it, and you learn it hopefully better than I did when you're between 12 to 18 years of age, where you're more able now to think in abstractions, formal, operational, formal, logical thought emerges. You can draw conclusions, you can come up with hypotheses, you look for evidence, and you can identify evidence to support the things that you are thinking about the world, right? So according to Piaget, this is how our cognition develops in these really neat little clean stages. But there are obviously issues with this. Now I'm just gonna look at the chat and then I'll see whatever you guys have to say. Abdullah, you keep your hand raised. Egocentrism implies that in the age the child's entire worldview is constructed around them, they can't process things separate from them as an entity. Yes, absolutely. And particularly they can't process that people have their own reactions, which are not the child's own reactions. The child thinks the whole world thinks like the child. Perspective taking. Josefa, you think the ages are not fixed. You're right. That is one of the greater criticisms of Piaget, that you can take it as too rigid, his approach. And I'll come to that. But that's good. When does emotional empathy develop? Is it the same as theory of mind? So theory of mind is perspective taking. Empathy is stepping into someone's frame of reference. So yes, there's theory of mind involved, but there is an emotional response also implied, where empathy requires you to also step into the emotions of another person without recognizing those emotions as your own. So if you have a good theory of mind, your capacity for empathy will be better. Another thing with theory of mind is that the more types of people you are exposed to, um, as in the more diverse exposure you have, the better your theory of mind will become. So you can take, you'll be more accurate at taking the perspective, let's say, of a person who's from a different race as yours, if you have had exposure to people of that particular race. If you haven't had exposure, you may not be able to see that. Okay, so that's something to remember. Um, but empathy is different. Empathy is like, I'm brown and you're white and you're grieving, and grieving is really hard. That's empathy, right? Do you get it? Okay. Let me see. Will the child never correct themselves even if you correct them repeatedly? So very importantly, Piaget didn't say that we should correct children. He said that children should make mistakes and we should facilitate them to self-correct the mistakes, and that they will self-correct the mistakes, because as their capacity for logical thought develops, they become more able to identify and correct their own mistakes. Um, is a 12-year-old completely developed to practice abstract thought, or does the development start at age 12? The development of abstract thought starts at age 12, according to Piaget. Abdullah, what did you have to say?
I was just saying that it's a small thing that is like, isn't this like this theory is some very like it's extremely generalizable in terms of like there can be like anomalies, right?
Yes, you're right. So maybe I can just tell you the criticisms of Piaget, which are probably on the next slide as well. No, they're not. Oh, baby math is here. Oh, okay. Well, baby math is in your textbook as well. Well, first thing, Piaget does not account for individual differences between children. Okay? Second problem, he does not account for the differences in the environment in different cultures. Third thing, these qualities that he says emerge at particular points in time. And he says that this is a framework for all human development in childhood, or the development of cognition in all human beings in childhood. That's what he said. But actually, some children acquire some things faster than others. Depending on what? Depending on the environment, right? So, for example, one of my first words was obnoxious. When I was 2.5 years old. I used the word obnoxious and I used it correctly. I mean, I don't personally know of many 2.5-year-olds that would be able to use that word, use it correctly, and so I guess I had a much more sophisticated language development for that age. And this is just my personal example, but you will see that in other children as well. I have a friend whose daughter is 5 years old and she can solve a Rubik's Cube in 5 minutes. That's amazing. But it's an outlier, right? It's an outlier to what Piaget was saying. Kids don't all develop in the exact same time. That's a pretty, I'm sorry, I'm hungry also. I'm eating some. But anyway, one of the main things that showed this problem of cultural contextualization, do you remember this stage right here, reversibility? And I told you it's about directions. And right up here before that, doodling and drawing. This experiment was done where children were asked to draw a map of their journey from home to school. Okay? children in developed countries, in developed white countries, do very basic maths, okay? Which were very linear and very like point A to point B. Same age children in India drew extremely detailed maps that pointed to different landmarks as well. So there would be like, village tree or community shop, mosque, this, that, temple. That was the map that was created by the same age children. So clearly, the environment has played a role there. Can you think of what the role might be? Competition? These children don't know each other. They've never met each other. Knowing the way to your home is not something that you're taught in school. What do you mean by observation? Walking versus taking the bus, maybe? Yeah, no. Inherited IQ? I don't know if you correctly understand what IQ is, but not relevant right now. Listening to their parents communicate addresses through landmarks, possibly, yes, absolutely. But what does that mean? There's a difference in what? Could be the traffic, yeah, could be. But like, what are all those things? You guys mentioned parents, teaching technique, safety, traffic, bus lena, walk karna, context. Thank you. Different cultural contexts. And Piaget does not account for that because his sample was white children in developed countries, which is the biggest problem with taking his theory as an absolute truth in the sense that if you think of Piaget's theory as something set in stone, that every child all over the world will take this journey in exactly this way, that is a problem. Yeah, that's the problem. But the content of his theory of cognitive development, to me personally, it makes a lot of sense. I think that I agree with certain aspects like, yes, children make meaning of the world, and the ways in which they make meaning of the world determines how they are able to deal with their lives. And the way that they make meaning of the world becomes more and more finely, highly developed as they go older. Absolutely, this is what I see around me. So I don't dispute that, right? And I think things like conservation, which is the volume and density, or reversibility, being able to perform in the backward or reverse engineer logical operations, all of those things, I think they're really important. And they absolutely do tend to emerge along these ages that he's mentioned, but that doesn't mean that those ages are set in stone and fixed, because again, I cannot ignore the influence of the environment. If a child doesn't have access to an environment that promotes higher level cognitive functioning, then perhaps his or her cognitive development will be slower than the stages that Piaget has outlined, right? Or if a child has access to a high functioning environment, maybe cognitive development will happen faster. So that's not accounted for, right? And second, Piaget has never talked about what happens when a child has a learning disability, which is the biggest issue here. All right? And that's what I mean when I talk about individual differences. Okay. I think Abdullah just answered this question right now. Because absolutely, yes, it does. A disability will affect the progression. And secondly, I want to make this clear. Affecting the developmental trajectory is not the same thing as saying that the developmental trajectory will be ineffective. Those are two very different things. Okay? So, something to keep in mind. Okay. Anything else? All right. Bye-bye. Wednesday, we will meet in person. And you're 105 students. I hope to see at least 40 of you in class. Okay. Very fair odds, 40-60. But there was 40% of you that demanded in-class instruction. And so if you filled out that Google survey and you said you want to be in class, then you get your butts to class. All right. All right. To the 64 of you that are left from the original 80 something, I say goodbye. And I'll see you on Wednesday, inshallah, in person. Take care. Be good. Be very good. And have a good week. Bye-bye.